Council for Dahm. So we're going to get started, and then I'm just going to let Senator Dahm take over.
Well, thank you all for coming out today. I know, especially with the ice and the weather and everything, it's a little bit more for people to travel and everything. But you all made it safely. I appreciate you opening up your business here to have this opportunity to talk about these pressing issues. I will have to first give a shout out to Senator Sykes. He and I were very close when we were in the legislature. Not to say we're not close now, but when we were in the legislature, we worked very closely together. He's out now, but he did a phenomenal job representing Duncan for years and other parts of Oklahoma. He was my mentor when I was up there, taught me a lot of things, was a wonderful constitutionalist, a strong conservative. Always really enjoyed working with him. So I want to give a shout out to him. I know he has his law practice still, and so he's busy with that. So he'll probably duck out at some point in time. And so I will say, if anybody needs to leave at any point in time, I know everybody else has other things going on today too. They have their own lives, they have other stuff. So I'm not offended by that. I understand a few people online as well. So thank you all joining online for that, coming and participating in this. But I just wanted to first take that opportunity to thank you all for getting involved, because one of the reasons that we aren't always able to accomplish what we want to accomplish is because not enough people get involved. That's just part of the process, part of the situation, and just the reality. Because most of us, and I don't want to necessarily put anybody in a particular party or be partisan or whatever, but as conservatives, the conservative idea is leave us alone, we'll take care of ourselves, like, just leave us be, right? So let us run our businesses, let us run our lives. We don't need the government telling us what to do. It's actually interesting. I have a book on somebody gave me a book on different quotes and writings of Thomas Jefferson, and just a selection of different things. And he talked about this, and of course this was 200 plus years ago, and he talked about how the big cities, which back then, a big city was 5,000 people or something, and how those areas would be considered more liberal and more reliant upon government. They would want more big government in their lives, whereas the more rural areas didn't want big government because they didn't need big government, because they had their own wells and produced their own water. They grew their own crops. They butchered their own animals. They were self-sufficient, so they didn't need the government. Whereas in those cities, a lot of those people wanted government involvement because they weren't self-sufficient, because they don't grow their own crops. They don't, provide their own food in that manner. And so I find it interesting how 200 years later, we can still see how some of the big cities, some of the mayors in those cities, some of those areas, how they want to dictate to everybody how to live their lives, and they want government to be the solution to everything. But like Reagan said, government isn't the solution. In most things, government is the problem. And I think that this pandemic that we've seen with a lot of this stuff, that government has been the problem, not necessarily the solution. And that's not to negate or say that COVID doesn't exist. It absolutely exists. It is, it has been deadly for hundreds of thousands of people across the country. Obviously, acknowledge that. And any life lost that is lost is a tragedy. And so we don't want to belittle that or negate that. We acknowledge that. But that doesn't mean that because there's a pandemic or because these certain things that we lose our constitutional rights. And many times government just wants to respond by doing something. Something has happened, so we need to respond with something else. Something must be done. And people forget that there is a balance in what should be done in the Constitution. I know one of your questions was asking about federalism, about the federal government versus the states. And Senator Sykes and I fought quite often against federal intrusion into our state, and trying to maintain what sometimes people will call states' rights. But that's a little bit of a false terminology, because if you read through the Constitution, one thing you'll see is that states don't have rights. Whenever it talks about states or whenever it talks about the federal government, it doesn't talk about rights. It talks about powers, right? If you read the Bill of Rights, it always talks about the individual, right? You know, the people have the right to peaceably assemble. The people have the rights to exercise their religion. The people have the right to keep and bear arms. It's about the people and about the individual having those rights. But if you read through it, like Article 1 talks about the legislative power. Article 2 is, dealing with the executive power. Article 3, it says the judicial power here invested by this Constitution. So it talks about the powers that are given to the federal government. And that goes back all the way to the Declaration of Independence, because the Declaration of Independence talks about rights too. We all know we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? But right after that, it says that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So why are governments created? To secure our rights, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. So the purpose for government is to protect our rights. And we can consent and give the government certain powers and certain authority to do certain things. And the Constitution does grant the federal government certain power, but everything else is supposed to be reserved to the state or to the people. So right now, with a lot of the things that are coming from the federal government just has absolutely no constitutional authority to be involved with it. A lot of the things that are happening with mayors at the city level, they don't have any constitutional, federally, state, they don't have any constitutional authority to be involved with it. And unless people speak up and push back on it, then we just see that government's going to continue to grow, liberty is going to continue to shrink. So that's why I filed several of these bills to do what is called state preempting. And a lot of local mayors and city councilors don't like that, because essentially what it does is the state preempts the local government from being able to do something. We have it across the state in many different areas. We've passed legislation for it in the past. For example, states cannot prohibit the sale of firearms. Why? Or cities can't prohibit it. Why? Because the state has said, cities, you cannot prohibit that because there's something called the Second Amendment, says the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So just because a city would maybe want to, I doubt it would happen here, but let's be honest, like probably in Norman or maybe some other cities, there'd be some places where the cities would love to ban the sale of firearms, the possession of firearms, anything they could dealing with firearms. Well, they don't have the authority to do that under the Constitution, right? But we have to sometimes go in as a state and take away what they might perceive as their authority and further say, no, you can't do that. So when it comes to state preemption, a lot of local mayors don't like that because they fall back on this idea, this concept of local control. And they say, well, if you're for small government or limited government, you should be for local control. And while that is true, the most local you can get is the individual, not the mayor, because the individual is more able to control their life than the mayor. And when they talk about local control, the thing that they often forget is that's still government control. Yes, it's your mayor and your city council, but they're still trying to control your life. And so with some of these things, that's why I introduced several bills that would prohibit cities from continuing to infringe upon people's lives. And so one of the bills was saying that governments, cities, counties, they cannot require a mask mandate. If a business wants to do that on private property, they can. If a business wants to say that people can't have firearms on their property, they can. If a business wants to restrict free speech on their private property and say, you can't say certain things on our private property, they have the right to do that because it's their private property. So that's absolutely within the authority of those private businesses, but it's not the government's job and responsibility to say, businesses, you have to have this mask mandate or you have to do this other thing or whatever. And if you don't, we're going to fine you or we're going to fine the individual. You as the business have to be the enforcer of it. Otherwise, you could be fined. This is beyond the authority and the scope of the government. So this is exposed in a lot of ways how much government can be out of control. So that's one of the bills that I have. Another bill that I had deals with contact tracing, which is something that the federal government is trying to push right now too. With contact tracing, they would essentially not just track you, but anyone you had contacted with. this is a huge violation of our constitutional rights to the Fourth Amendment to be secure in our persons, papers, and effects, to say that they can be able to track us anywhere we go. And in other countries, this has gotten very extreme, where in some nations, you actually have to text the government before you leave your house as part of their pandemic response. In other countries, we've seen that they've had continued curfews, extensive curfews, where you can't be out other than going to or from your job. But even here in this country, we've seen violations of the First Amendment in multiple ways regarding churches and freedom of religion. And a lot of times people just see the First Amendment as a freedom of religion issue, but people forget that the First Amendment also covers freedom of speech. And it also covers the freedom to be able to gather together, right? Which is something that applies to businesses. If the government is saying that you can only have 10 people in your church or your establishment, well, that's a violation of the First Amendment. Whether or not you're exercising free speech, whether or not it is religious in nature, that's a violation of the First Amendment as well. So we've seen how government has very much infringed upon our rights. So myself, Senator Bullard, several other people have filed bills to make sure that businesses can stay open in the future, that workers are classified as essential, all workers, not just the ones that the government picks and chooses. And that actually goes back to the Oklahoma Constitution, which has a provision in it that's better even than the U.S. Constitution, because we have a provision that says that you have the right to the gains of your industry. And you have the right to be able to go out and work a job and get paid for that, or to own a business and make a profit from it. So even though the U.S. Constitution doesn't specifically address that, the Oklahoma Constitution does. So a lot of these lockdowns, a lot of these mandates, a lot of these things are a violation of numerous provisions in the U.S. Constitution and in the Oklahoma Constitution. Unfortunately, fear is a big driver. Human nature responds to emotional things, but especially to fear. And a lot of people are very afraid of this. Understandably so. There are people out there that are immunocompromised. There are people out there with comorbidities. There are healthy people out there that have been exposed to the virus that have had serious health effects or that have lost their lives because of it. But we shouldn't automatically respond to fear by allowing the loss of liberties. Because the Constitution, like I said, does not stop just because there's a pandemic. The First Amendment does not have a qualifier on it that says that you can limit it to 10 people because the CDC recommended that months ago. They've changed their recommendations time and time again. So the first thing that I always encourage people to do is to contact your elected officials, whether it's at the local level, the city council, the mayor. I know we've got a couple candidates here in city council here. Your state rep, your state senator. Contact all of them and find out where they are on this and see if they understand that their main job should be about protecting people's rights. Because I'm not going to put Senator Sykes on the spot here. I'll say it myself, and he can agree later if he wants to. But the majority of the people that we serve with don't see it from that perspective. They don't see it as their job is to uphold the Constitution, to protect people's rights. They see it, they have been elected to make decisions for everybody that they represent. Rather than trying to protect the people to be able to make their own decisions, they feel like they've been put in that place, position, because it is a position of power, to use that power to make those decisions for everyone else. And so your initial contact with them should be about asking them where they stand on all these things. And I will say, sometimes I know these things we can be very passionate about them. There's a lot of things that, a lot of emotions that can run high on it. But for myself, it usually doesn't go over very well if the email starts off with, "Hey, what are you doing?" Right? I don't know if you all appreciate it. You get a text message or something like that. So you should always initiate contact from a polite perspective, find out where they are, and then if you get to bring with them, we sort of disagree in a polite way without name calling and all those other things, and try to engage in a dialogue. That always is more helpful. So I encourage you to reach out to your state senators, your state reps, all those people. And specifically on bills, I know that I think you have in the package, you have some bills. There's a process that we call co-authoring. So I filed the bill, so I am the primary author. So it'll say Senate Bill 255 by Dahm, right? Because it's my bill, so it's got my name on it. But anybody else can join on to that and put their name on it and say, I agree with that, I support that. The more co-authors we get on it, the more that it encourages other people to join with it, and the more support it shows. So you can contact not just your state senator and your state representative, but any of them and all of them, and ask them to co-author it. But then the other thing is, once a bill has been filed, it gets assigned to be heard in one of the Senate committees. And so right now, some of the bills are in the Health and Human Services Committee, and some of the bills are in the General Government Committee, and some of the bills are in the Business and Commerce Committee. And so it's made up of a certain number of senators, and you can go to the website, oksenate.gov, and you can see where you can search for the bill, you can see which committee the bill has been assigned to, and then you can go find all those committee members, and you can email all of them and ask them to support the bill. You can call their office and ask them to support the bill. And so ask them to co-author the bill, because it's going to be up to them first and foremost. If they agree to pass the bill, then it goes to the full Senate. So there are several steps along the process to get these bills passed. And we only have 2 weeks left to be able to get bills heard and passed in committee. If we don't get any movement on it in the next 2 weeks, these bills are pretty much finished for this year. So that's why I appreciate you having me out here right now during this time period, because the way our schedule works, we only have the month of February to get those bills done. So it is important that people start contacting those senators on those committees right away, asking them to co-author the bill, asking them if they want the bill heard, if they agree with the bills being heard, so that we can find out where they are on those bills. So that's kind of a quick overview on it. I think you had some other questions, but I'm happy to take questions from anyone in particular, or anybody that has any questions. I know that was a lot of information really quick. So, yes, sir.
Well, I want, Senator. First of all, thanks so much for all your good hard work in Senator Sykes at Peaceville here on the Second Amendment Association. We know how important your bills and your work has been in that, and so looking forward to the same success in these the ones you mentioned. I just have a question, and I know it's a little late in the session to introduce any new bills, but is there any possibility or when we might be able to pursue something like North Dakota is just doing, and South Dakota, which is essentially a resurrection of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that would establish a constitutional evaluation committee, for lack of a better term, as I understand what those states are doing, to evaluate the potential overreach of the U.S. general government into our individual sovereignty. And I was just wondering, your bills address specifics of that, and but would sure like to see sometime in the near future legislation that would address the entire Bill of Rights protections.
So I'll hit a few things on that. If you didn't hear, he was asking about North Dakota recently introduced some legislation, or South Dakota, one or both of them, I think.
Both did now.
That would push back on executive orders from the federal government, from the U.S. president. And so you asked about filing a new bill. It's too late in the process to file a new bill, but I filed a lot of bills.
Yeah.
So I am looking to see if I could take one of my bills and replace the current language with language from North or South Dakota. I have already an existing bill dealing similar to that, which I passed it through the Senate previously, but it stalled in the House. And this was, I think, actually, I started it like 4 years ago. What my bill would say is that at any time during session, the legislature could pass a resolution and direct our state agencies to not implement a federal agency rule. So right now you have ATF trying to implement rules. You have the EPA implementing rules that impact oil and gas.
Security.
Yeah, you have all these different state agencies that they pass their own rules, and then they expect our state agencies to implement them. So we could be a buffer by directing our state agencies and saying, no, you are not going to implement that rule that harms oil and gas. No, you are not going to implement that ATF rule that violates the Second Amendment. Now, when I first introduced this, and it might have been even more than 4 years ago, one of the chairmen didn't want to hear the bill because he said it was unconstitutional. So I showed him actually Supreme Court precedent, Supreme Court cases that says, it's called the anti-commandeering doctrine, that says that the federal government cannot commandeer state employees, state actors, and force them to implement any federal agency rule. Now, the Supreme Court said they can incentivize them to do it by bribing them with money, which is what the feds do now. They'll have those strings attached. You've all heard that terminology. So they have strings attached to it. But so my bill that I already currently have would say, no, we're going to be able to direct our state agencies not to do it. I'm not sure if I can amend that bill and expand it to include executive orders or not, because we have something called a single subject rule here in Oklahoma, where every bill can only touch one subject. It's not like the federal government where they'll put on all these amendments with unrelated things and, to try to sweeten the bill or poison the bill or whatever. We only can touch one subject at a time. So I'm not sure if I can add the executive order provision to my existing bill, or if I need to find a separate bill to put the language in. But I am looking at both of those because I've been contacted by numerous people on that. And that would help with this COVID stuff too, because a lot of this stuff Biden is trying to do through executive orders or implementing it through agencies, different things. So I feel like it's prime opportunity for that bill to get passed. Truthfully, the reason that it didn't go forward previously is because they said, well, we don't need this right now because Trump is president. And I told them, well, Trump is not always going to be president, so we should be prepared for it. But now hopefully they'll see the need for that and we'll be able to make that passed.
I understand that they want to allow the state Supreme Court to check if the executive order is constitutional, and they will decide. The Supreme Court of the state will decide if the executive order.
I think one of them was the state Supreme Court, one of them was the Attorney General, or they worked together like through the Attorney General or something.
I read the Supreme Court.
Yeah, that's a very interesting idea that I heard from. Do you have another question, sir?
Well, I don't want to, if somebody else does,
I'll make
that.
Scott ask a question.
We get enough questions via phone.
Yeah. That's good. Well,
I'm curious about, recently it was announced that Biden is researching feasibility of
Yeah.
the travel, with the digital travel passport and the common passport. The common passport is being traveling in state and doing the work. So, your bill or any other bill being prohibiting this? How's that working?
Yes, so on the COVID passports that they're talking about, I have a bill that would somewhat address this, and I had to build mine kind of in a different legal structure. So right now under federal law, you cannot discriminate against someone based on their sex, on their religion, on their age, right? There's certain things that you cannot discriminate on. So if somebody comes in the coffee shop and you tell them, no, we're not going to serve you because you're a woman, yeah, serve you because you're a man, not going to do that. We're not going to serve you because you're a Christian, can't do that, right? There are certain things that you cannot do currently under federal law because those are discrimination against those protected classes of people that are protected by the Bill of Rights. And so I have a bill that would say that anyone can refuse to receive the vaccine based on their religious observance if the vaccine used aborted fetal cells either in the vaccine or for the development of the vaccine, because all of them have done one or the other. They either have aborted fetal cells in the vaccine itself, or they have used aborted fetal cells to develop the COVID vaccine. My bill doesn't specify only COVID vaccine. It says any vaccine you can refuse to receive that, and on religious grounds. So then what would happen if somebody were to refuse you service based on you not having the vaccine, that would be a way that you would have a civil rights lawsuit against them on a religious perspective because they're violating you because of your religion. And so my intent with that is the airlines, because Biden might not be able to force it through an executive order or whatever, but what they'll try to do is they'll try to get the airlines to implement it then instead and say, we're just not going to serve you unless you actually have received the vaccine. And so if they were to try to do that in Oklahoma and one person were to sue then it would go to federal court, and I believe it would be upheld that it's a violation of their rights, and then that would basically prohibit it anywhere across the country. So that's one. On the testing side of it, to say that you have to have a positive, or you have to be able to show a negative test to be able to. We might be able to expand my bill to do the same thing on a religious grounds, but I think that's our best argument is on religious grounds to say that's discrimination, to be able to stop that. But that is going to be an uphill battle, and that is going to end up being fought in the courts to a degree. So that's why I want to use existing Supreme Court precedents on discrimination on religious grounds to be able to make sure that people can still travel. Because the U.S. Constitution doesn't specify that, particularly that we do have a right to travel, but that is perceived as an inherent right, that you do have the right to freely move and free travel. That's one thing that is uniquely American, that you should be able to travel without government interference. So that one is going to be a little bit more of an uphill battle, but it is something that we are trying to fight.
I saw that in the Federal Register, it defined shared ride. And that definition was very concerning to me because then under the passport, I was everybody riding the cars, that it depends.
Sure.
Isn't there a current, kind of touching on that right now as far as mandates and mandatory and all of this? Can you touch on, I believe there's a current bill that touches on mandating vaccines, businesses doing that with employees. I'd like to hear kind of what's going on with that.
I think that's in your
It's
packet.
in here?
I believe
Okay.
so. That's Senator Bullard's bill.
Yeah.
So my bill would touch on that also.
If you can repeat the question on
Good question. Yes, okay. Sorry, she had asked about businesses mandating and requiring vaccines. So we have current statute in Oklahoma, similar to the federal statute on what those protected classes are and some of those things. Senator Bullard has a bill that would also say that you cannot hire or cannot fire someone or punish someone if they refuse to get any vaccine, not just on the COVID vaccine. So his bill is in there. It was on one of the committee agendas last week, but I think the vote was very tight. So I don't know how close it was, but he decided to pause on it for a bit and try and work on maybe changing some language to make it a little bit more comfortable for some people that had some concerns. But that is still available. The committee chairman did agree to hear it, which is always the first step in a good sign. So there is a possibility of that going forward. But that committee meets on Thursdays. So actually, I was in that committee and I drove straight here from there. It wasn't on our agenda for this week, but we still have 2 more Thursdays to be able to hear that bill.
Okay.
And that bill is in the Business and Commerce Committee. So you can, if you go to okcenter.gov, look up the Business, Commerce, and Tourism Committee, you'll see all those committee members, and you can start contacting them and asking them if they support the bill. If not, why not? And then start encouraging them.
Okay. I am hearing that there needs to be some protections for businesses. I'd like to understand what in the world that means. Why are we so concerned about, you understand what I'm saying? I mean, obviously people are. What are the concerns for businesses regarding this?
So I think when people talk about that, and this is something that I think Senator Bullard is trying to maybe address in his, is the liability aspect of it. So if a business cannot require their employees to be vaccinated, and then somebody comes into that business, which people are voluntarily choosing to come in that business, but if they come into that business and they are exposed to COVID for some reason or whatever, then that person could try and sue the business.
Okay.
And so what it would do is put in liability protection in there and say, yes, the business is not required or cannot force their employees to be vaccinated,
Yes.
but at the same point in time, they can't be held liable
Right.
for it. It's unfortunate that we have to do that type of thing.
Yeah.
People are voluntarily choosing to come into a business and make a transaction. But we have a very lawsuit-oriented society now where everybody wants to sue for everything. So a lot of times we do have to think about the liability perspective of things to make sure to have those protections. So I think that's one thing that he's trying to work on to change his bill a little bit to make sure that the businesses are protected as well. Yes, sir, you have another question?
Well, I don't want to take time. I guess my other question is a bit esoteric given the time frame of the legislature, but there's a federal law in place now that prohibits the approval by the FDA of experimental drugs if there is a alternative therapeutic. Well, if you look on the Moderna and the Pfizer labels, several things you'll discover. One, I believe it says it's experimental. Number two, it says it's not a vaccine, that it's a gene therapy application. And it was fast-tracked because both hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin were deemed by the establishment to be either dangerous or ineffective, which worldwide is not the case.
Or inexpensive in reality.
Yeah, inexpensive. So my point is that the fast tracking of whether you're a truck guy or not, sort of, the fast tracking, what was it called? Warp speed was really not a legitimate legal activity, since there are therapeutics available to treat this so-called pandemic. The other thing about experimental drugs, again, I was saying this is esoteric a bit, because the Nuremberg Code prohibits it without informed consent. So if we feel like we haven't had informed consent, because our medical establishment, the CDC and the worldwide, the WHO, has maybe been misleading, and we know that the PCR test is not a diagnostic test. It's got 94% false positive, and the other one is also
PCR test.
yeah. It's all bogus. So given that, what can we do as a state? Again, I admit it's esoteric because you can't file new bills, but we need to be thinking about this as we go forward. What can we do as a state to, lack of a better term, implement our 10th Amendment right so that we as individuals maintain our sovereignty?
Well, there's several things that we can do, but the biggest thing is we just have to have people informed.
Yeah.
And I mean, we're seeing social media censorship. They are memory holding anything that they don't agree with.
Yes.
That, I heard, I think just yesterday, YouTube even removed a video of doctors testifying before the U.S. Senate.
Okay.
So
They did.
we have to provide information to other people. And yes, we need to use social media and the means that we can to get people educated and informed. We need to understand how to push back on the narratives because the media absolutely is pushing narratives all the time. People don't realize that. But I'm amazed at how many people will contact me and just regurgitate something that they heard on the news, and without checking it, without looking into any aspect of it, just because they heard it. Unfortunately, we've lost logic in a lot of ways. People don't follow logic. A lot of it is just emotional. And I know, to borrow Ben Shapiro's saying, facts don't care about your feelings. But the reason that they are moving so much to emotions and to your truth and my truth and all these things is because emotions are more easily manipulable than facts. You can manipulate emotions much easier than you can the facts. And so we have to learn, we have to educate people and teach them that to understand those things. So that's one of the main things is just education, like
Right.
getting people informed and knowledgeable on these things. Because a lot of them haven't even
I think we want to look to leaders like you to give us direction on how we educate,
Well,
because
And that's why I come out to places like this, and that's why we do things like this. On, on
our
social media.
indoctrination system called the public schools are failing us. And
So today, if somebody has COVID that is positive and would like to try the hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin, can he ask the doctor to prescribe this?
My understanding is that they can, but the doctor won't prescribe it for that. They have to essentially prescribe it for a different reason, or they won't fill the prescription.
Okay.
This is anecdotal, but I've even heard from other people that wanted to get it, and when they went to the pharmacy asked, "Well, what are you going to be using this?" And they did push back and said, "Well, that's none of your business." And the doctor prescribed it, and so there is a concerted effort to control the availability of that and be able to use that.
But I just received a prescription refill from ivermectin, and none of those questions were asked, so it's doable.
Yes, sir.
Does
Just gotta
John
find the right
Michael
physician.
co-sponsor any of these three bills and or kids from Morica?
I don't know that either of them have, and John Michael sits right behind me, and Chris Kidd sits right next to me also. They're both good guys, but I haven't
Are they
personally.
hospitable about it?
I think so, but
Okay.
you all need to contact them and,
Yep.
and ask them about that as well.
We will.
I mean, I talk to the members about the different bills and stuff, but reach out to them and ask them, because yes, as a senator, I'm going to ask for their vote, but if you're constituents or you know constituents, that means even more. So reach out to them and ask them. I've worked with them on a lot of things before, so I would think this would be something that they would be open to, but I don't want to speak on their behalf and say yes or no one way or the other. Yes, ma'am.
Could you share your pro-life bill with us, and then any other ones you think would be good for us to know about?
So I have 3 pro-life bills. I have my list. So I filed more bills this year than I ever have before, and more than anybody else. So I have 86 bills that I'm working on. I don't have them all memorized. I have passed 14 through committee last week and this week, and I have commitments from probably 10 more at least. So I think I have at least 25 that'll go through this year. But my Senate Bill 584. Right now, currently, we have a prohibition on state money going to Planned Parenthood. But my bill would say no other government money, whether that's local or county or education or any other entity cannot give money to Planned Parenthood. And my original bill specifically said Planned Parenthood, but we have existing law that prohibits money going to, the way it's phrased is any organization or affiliate that was found guilty of trafficking in fetal body parts, which Planned Parenthood did. And so we actually want to keep that language, because it's not just Planned Parenthood. If any other organization starts and is found guilty of that, we want to make sure to cut them off and not have to just add their name, whatever group that might be. So the new version doesn't specifically mention Planned Parenthood, but it does cover them. And then also my bill on Senate Bill 612, that is a request from Students for Life. And that bill would say that no one can perform an abortion other than to save the life of the mother. If the mother's life is at risk, you could save the life of the mother. And then the other bill is also a Students for Life request bill. That one I just mentioned was introduced in Arkansas, but hasn't passed yet. But since we're neighboring states, I introduced that one. This other one, Senate Bill 723, passed in Georgia, and it changed it to where no longer would the doctor just offer if they want to hear the heartbeat or test for the heartbeat. Now the doctor would be required to test for the heartbeat. And rather than at 6 weeks, it would be at 4 weeks and beyond. The doctor would have to test for a heartbeat. And if there is a heartbeat, then they would be prohibited from performing the abortion. So it's not as much as the one that just prohibits it other than life of the mother. But this would be at 4 weeks time period. If there is a heartbeat, that life should be protected. So that's that one. There's a lot of other bills that I'm dealing with and working on different things. I have bills on the Fourth Amendment. I have bills on a lot of different things. Making sure that the church is defined as essential, so churches can't be shut down in the future. Senator Bullard, I believe, has that as well. Make sure the businesses are defined as essential so that they can't be shut down as well. And then one other one that's kind of along the same line is I mentioned that to say that cities or counties can't have a mask mandate, but I have a separate bill that says that no governmental entity can deny you government services or enumerated rights, whether or not you are wearing a mask or whether or not you have or do not have any sort of vaccine. Because I know I was actually recently in Tulsa County at the courthouse, there for other meetings or whatever, but I actually I walked by the courtrooms, and the courtroom said, you may not enter this courtroom unless you are wearing a mask and gloves. Well, if somebody has sued you, rightly or wrongly or whatever, you should have the right to be able to go and defend yourself, and they should not be able to deny you your right to be able to do that. And so that just violates, again, so many provisions. And it's not just that. I mean, you know, if you're going to go in to pay your water bill or your trash bill or whatever, you know, they should be able to deny you access to service based on those parameters. So my bill would make sure to say that they cannot deny you whether or not you do or do not have a mask or do or do not have any sort of vaccine, because while they're trying to force businesses to do it, they're going to try and do the same thing in the government as well. They're attacking it every way they can, trying to force this upon everyone. So I'm trying to push back on it in every which way that I can as well. Yes, sir.
Do you think there's anything at the state level we could do in case the general government wants to impose restrictions on receipt of federal benefits like Social Security and VA benefits if we don't conform to their mandates?
So that is a little bit harder to be able to address, because those are federal programs.
Yes.
I mean, individual citizens have paid into those programs, and so if they do try to go about that route, that's going to be an uphill battle for sure to do that. But I would think that the most direct route would be for the Attorney General to sue in federal court and to try to say that they can't take away benefits. Especially, I would think that would be a violation of two provisions of the Constitution. One, maybe it could be considered ex post facto because they're retroactively doing it. Now, ex post facto generally deals with criminal things. You know, you can't criminally charge someone, but I would also think that you might be able to, and I'm not a lawyer, I wish Senator Sykes was here, he could explain it better, but I don't think you could retroactively take that away. But the other thing that I think it would violate is the Bill of Attainder clause, which nobody knows what the Bill of Attainder clause is, but it's one of my little pet projects because I feel like Obamacare was a violation of the Bill of Attainder clause.
Certainly
The
was.
Constitution says you cannot have a Bill of Attainder. A Bill of Attainder is basically classifying a group of people of committing a specific violation and then penalizing them for that. So a Bill of Attainder could be directed at a specific race. A Bill of Attainder could be trying to attack, specific gender, saying this only applies to men or only applies to women. A Bill of Attainder could be potentially veterans then, if they were to target veterans or whatever and say you can't have your VA benefits unless you do X, Y, Z. And so Obamacare, I felt like, was a Bill of Attainder because it was a group of people, those without insurance, that it said, you will do this, you will buy insurance, or you will face this penalty and get fined. So I felt like it was a Bill of Attainder, and I felt like it should have been challenged that way. But RAG at the time took it a different route. So there might be, a cause for action under the Bill of Attainder under the U.S. Constitution if they try to do that, because again, Social Security, if they're going after a group of people that already have those claims and punishing them for a perceived violation or whatever. So I think that might be a way that we could get a lawsuit, but that would be tried in the courts mostly. I don't know of any specific legislation that we can do to address that because Social Security and that stuff comes from the feds.
Thank you.
Yeah. That's a good question.
Going back to immunizations, and one thing I'm getting here, their children, their people, and return, and they're only concerned at COVID. So when I look at the recommendations and requirement list, while the flu shot is just a recommendation, it's not a requirement. So parents are asking me, well, how do you approach this? And then the other thing is, who do you go to remove stuff from like the recommended column, and some of the things from the requirement column of immunization.
So she asked about immunizations, especially with children in schools. This is something that has been kind of a hot topic in the legislature for several years now. We had a doctor who previously was trying to change it to where the only exemption possible for a parent for their child was a medical exemption. Under current Oklahoma law, you can get a medical exemption or you can do what's called a philosophical or religious exemption, meaning you don't have to go and get doctor's permission. You can just say that philosophically I disagree with immunizations, or for religious purposes I disagree with it, and so you can opt out of those requirements by having that exemption. He was trying to remove the philosophical and religious and say only if you get a doctor's note saying that your child is at risk for adverse reaction, or whatever. So he filed that bill and got a lot of moms, especially those with immunocompromised children, or even those that had children who had allergic reactions had bad reactions to immunizations. They got involved and got informed, and we defeated that bill. He's no longer there in the Senate because he kept pushing that year after year. So we still have those laws on the books. However, I just had a bill pass on Tuesday dealing with it because several school districts have sent out information to parents with either false information or not full information. They have sent out information to parents saying that your child must be on this schedule and have all these vaccines by this date, or they cannot participate. They cannot participate. They weren't mentioning that there is an opt-out provision, or that that you could get those exemptions. So I had a bill that passed this committee on Tuesday that would say that it would just make a uniform standard. Every school district, on any information that they send out regarding vaccines, that they have to include the current information from the state about, yes, here's the current schedule, the recommended schedule, but here's also how you can get a doctor's exemption or a personal exemption by going to the Oklahoma Department of Health website. You can call this number and get more information so that parents are informed. Now, that's not to say that those school districts have to send out that notice to everyone, but what it's saying is if they are sending out any notice dealing with that, they have to include that information. It's still up to the school district, but what we've been seeing is those school districts have been sending out false or misleading or not fully informed information to people. So I had that bill, I believe it was last year. We had a lot of bills that passed, either the Senate or the House, but then once COVID hit, we had to shut down and everything. Our session was short, so we didn't get out the bills passed. So this bill, I feel like hopefully we'll be able to get that through. These parents will be informed about their choices and their options. But right now, parents do have that. That is an Oklahoma statute. They can select to get an exemption if they want to do so. So that is not required.
But it seems
But they just don't know it.
yeah, but the confusion is when you look at the website, they have that chart. They have recommended and apply. So then you're being told by something. And like with the mask, the CDC never said that if they required, it was recommended, considered, we,
But that's where it gets back to informing people. And there is like I said, when the former senator who was a doctor started to try to take away the exemptions, there was a group of they call it mama bears that got involved, and they have an organization that they actually they've been active in Oklahoma for 5+ years now. I think it might be longer than that. And they actually send out candidate surveys, send people running not just for state house and senate, but they've started doing it for city council races. And so, like on Tuesday, I know that several people that several of their candidates that either got elected or advanced to the next election. And so they have a Facebook group, they have a website. It's ways people can get informed about that. So I encourage people to join that. It's called Oklahomans for Health and Parental Choice, I believe, or something like that. And so
I know who you're talking about. And it's a pretty long time.
yeah, it's a very long time. But there's on Facebook, there's groups like that people can get involved with, get informed, and share that information. Because you're right, the school districts aren't giving all the correct information. and it is misleading and where parents might not know the rights and choices that they have. So that just goes back to getting people informed. Yeah. No, you gotta
Well, people need to learn some keywords.
You have a website somewhere where you can get update on what you're doing and
So my website is nathandahm.com, but it's not up right now. I'm having somebody rebuild it and everything. I do most of my posts and stuff on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I'll post those things on that. Especially videos, mostly on Facebook. If it's other things that I can share, more concise stuff, memes, or just some text and stuff on the other ones. But Facebook, during session I try to do like a weekly update. So my last one was from last Friday. I'll probably do another one tonight or tomorrow about just kind of what happened throughout this week and just kind of give updates as they go along. But my Facebook page, search Nathan Dahm for any of those, and that's where I share most of my stuff. Thankfully, so far, Facebook hasn't kicked me off or censored me or put me in jail or anything yet. But I am working to make sure that I have people's contact information in case that happens, emails, phone numbers, all that stuff, because we've seen them censor people time and time again. Yeah. Thank you for asking that. Do you have any questions? Anybody online or anything? Or have...
So not at this time, Nathan.
All right. How are we doing on time? 3:30, 3:34, is that what it said? Okay.
can you explain the real ID? And if we have to go to that, or if we can keep the other one, or what the difference is?
Sure. So she asked about real ID, and there's a lot of backstory to that. Senator Sykes and I both stopped and opposed that for years. I believe it's unconstitutional. The federal government doesn't have the authority to require us to have a national ID or any of those types of parameters. But it was passed back in, I believe it was 2012, 2013, in response to 9/11. And if you all remember, back in 9/11, there was a lot of fear. And so, again, we had to do something. So this is one of the things that they came up with, was saying, well, we're going to require more secure, supposedly secure IDs. And so they put in some parameters of what was supposed to happen. When they first passed it, they said, we're also going to give the states money to be able to enact this. Again, that's that bribery thing. They can't force us to do it, but they were going to give us money to do it. But a former state senator, actually, it was bipartisan, it was a Republican and Democrat, got together and they said, we don't agree with this. So they actually passed a bill that prohibited the state of Oklahoma from implementing real ID. So that was on our laws for a long time period. It said, we will not implement real ID. Now, the Department of Public Safety is responsible for our driver licenses. So they, rather than violate the law and implement real ID, they started implementing all the provisions of real ID and called them best practices. So they started implementing it without actually implementing it as real ID. So they didn't technically violate the law, and it would have been hard to prove, but they were working towards implementing real ID. So real ID again was passed back in, I think, 2002 or 2003. There was a timeline of when it was supposed to be done. Every October since that deadline, it has been pushed back, saying, okay, next October, next October, next October. The feds have threatened us time and time again, if you don't get it passed, don't get this changed, you will not be able to board an airplane, you will not be able to travel, you will not be able to do these things. Every year they gave us an extension because we weren't the only state that hadn't done it. Most of the states hadn't done it. So we are now 20 or 18 years later since we needed this secure system to stop another 9/11 from happening, and it still hasn't been implemented. So it wasn't truly necessary, but the majority of the states have passed it now. Oklahoma a few years ago did repeal our prohibition on it and did start implementing it. And so that's part of the problem right now with the driver licenses. You have to actually schedule an appointment to go get your new license. And because of such a backlog, a lot of the tag agents are booked out months in advance. And so people didn't know about this getting implemented. DPS botched the rollout of it. They weren't prepared for it, even though they had already started doing some of the stuff in violation of existing law at the time. So there's been some major issues with it.
System crashes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the system, it's not a good system. But you can still get a normal license. You don't have to get the real ID license. It's just considered non-compliant, and so it'll still work as your driver license as identification as well. Here in the state of Oklahoma, it just will not be recognized by federal facilities. So if you go to a military base, if you go through TSA, go to the Social Security office, they might not accept it. You can use your passport. You can use other forms of identification. You can, even right now, people don't know this, but you can fly without a driver license. You just have to have other forms of identification, like a credit card statement and a bill for your home. And TSA will still, you have to go through some extra hoops. But even right now, so when they say you won't be able to fly, that's not true. It's extra hoops. I encourage people to get your passport anyways, because it's good for 10 years and it's not that much more expensive. And you can use it internationally if you ever do want to travel or go somewhere else. So encourage people to do that. But I'll tell you this story about it too, because in one of the committees, and I don't think Senator Sykes would have a problem with me telling the story, somebody asked, well, what's going to be the difference between a real ID compliant license and our current license? And the spokesman for DPS said, well, the real ID will have a special signal or special symbol on it or something to identify it as a real ID, most likely with a hologram. And Senator Sykes asked, well, what kind of a symbol will this be? And he said, well, many states have started putting a little blue star on the license to signify it. And Senator Sykes asked, I'm sorry, but are you saying that the U.S. government is using a blue star to mark a certain segment of our population? Because I'm pretty sure throughout history there's been similar things that have happened and made that correlation. That a lot of people were like, "Oh wow," which that's not to, again, to say what happened in past history is not to compare the two. But I don't know if you all heard what recently happened with one of the ladies from Star Wars. She talked about how in Nazi Germany, how they dehumanized the Jews, and way before the secret police and the Stasi and the SS and all them started coming after them, that they dehumanized them in the general populace. And she was fired by Germany for making that quote unquote Holocaust comparison, where she was talking about how the government is trying to separate people and trying to shame people and trying to dehumanize people. And we're seeing a lot of this is happening and taking place. And so there are concerns about the COVID vaccine or the COVID passport, quote-unquote passport, being tied to real ID and some of those things to be able to prohibit you from being able to move freely unless you have a real ID, because that's going to be your way of proving that you have the COVID vaccine too. So there are some real concerns about how those can be tied together. You can, like I said, you can get the non-real ID compliant license. You just won't necessarily be able to use it to enter.
Is that like this run of the year, or will?
It'll be the same time periods. It'll be the same time frames. Yeah, was it 3 years or whatever?
And do these others has a way to track you with that? What does it have on it that the other one doesn't?
So the real ID, the reason it's supposedly real ID is that it has that hologram. It's harder to forge that type of passport or that type of a document. But the real problem with it is on the back end, because you have to show your you have to show a birth certificate, you have to show social security number or some other means of identification. So they say it's more secure because you have to provide that information, and then you get the license, which is harder to forge. But the real chink in it is at the beginning, because if you forge a birth certificate or anything else, which you can do fairly easily depending on the city or the other country that it is in, so you could forge it on that end, and then yes, you go and you get a real ID that is supposedly secure, but that's where it's not really actually secure like they claim it is, where it still is very vulnerable to people being able to use it in that nefarious way. So their reasoning for trying to secure things is really true, because there's still ways to get around the system. But yeah, they say it's more secure, they say it's more verifiable, and it's harder to forge, and so that way you'll be able to prove who you are with more certainty, supposedly. So that's why the real ID came about.
requiring the PKI authentication chip in those IDs. I know some states are requiring that. So
I don't think we are, and we might be. I know that was one of the things that they didn't do under best practices when they were doing that, but I'm not sure if they incorporated it into it now or not. Now that we are going towards full real ID compliance, I'm not positive on that. I can find out and get back to you on that, but I'm not sure.
I guess I'm wondering, you mentioned before that it's your position that you're supposed to protect people's rights. But then you're saying we need to call and contact our senators to listen to bills. That makes them feel like they're really just representing people, right? So it kind of goes back to that. But so my thing is like, what's the likelihood that your bills will be heard, especially the ones about the mandates, the vaccines and stuff? Because in my opinion, that's the most pertinent violation, human rights violation, individual rights violation. So what is like the likelihood that those bills would even be heard this time, and how is it really the majority calling the you said the committee and really pressuring him, or is it really his opinion that that's the most important thing to be heard right now?
So the way the system is set up is the committee chair has sole authority to decide what bills are or are not heard. And the system is set up that way because then there's one person who essentially is the stopgap and can basically take the brunt of all that pressure. So for good or for bad, they can stop the bill and then they can take sole authority for it. So everybody else can point the finger at them and say, I supported it, but the chairman wouldn't hear that. So that's kind of how the insider game is played, so to speak. I hate to call it a game, but a lot of times it is. I mean, that's just how it works. I don't like that system. I've tried to change the system over the years, but yes, some of them, some members will be responsive to their constituents. Some of them will be responsive to more pressure from other people. If they start getting dozens or hundreds of phone calls and emails and some of this stuff, they'll either come to the Senate author of the bill and say, hey, please tell everybody to stop calling me, I'm supportive of it, or hey, yeah, I don't like it, but please get them to stop. And so it is unfortunately a lot of times about putting pressure on it if they're not willing to support it. I mean, that's part of the process. I still tell everybody you got to be polite when you're doing that, but it's a numbers game because you have to get 25 senators. There's 48 of us. You have to get 25 senators to pass a bill. There's 101 House members. You have to get 51 of them to pass the bill also, and then you got to get the governor to sign it. But before that, you got to get the chairman to hear the bill. So I'll tell you on some of these bills, some of the chairmen have said that they don't like the bill, they don't plan on hearing the bill, but I haven't gotten a commitment from any of the chairmen, yes or no, either way. Yes. 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 So none of them have told me absolutely no, I'm not hearing your bill, but none of them have told me absolutely yes either. So I have a couple of Health and Human Services. Yeah, the vaccine ones are Health and Human Services. And I have the bill to prohibit local mask mandates, government mask mandates. That's in general government. And then my bills on churches essential and businesses essential are in business and commerce. So those are the three committees that have all the bills kind of touching on these topics for different reasons. So yeah, I mean, it wouldn't hurt to call the chairman and ask them, what do you stand on these bills? Again, be polite, but find out where they stand and why. But ultimately, it is a number thing. You got to get one person to agree to it first, and then you got to get 51% of the committee to hear it, and then 51% of the Senate to hear it, to vote yes. So it gets more and more. But that first person is the chairman if they agree to hear it or not.
Questions. Okay. What do you find is your biggest hurdle in getting the term? The one you're talking about where you were going to add a Bullard was going to add two more things, maybe to clarify if that was maybe a hurdle that you can kind of, take care of. What are the big ones that you have in here?
So a former senator that I know said it this way. He said, at the Capitol, the biggest fight is not Republican versus Democrat. It's not House versus Senate, and it's not urban versus rural. Because most people think those are the fights. Okay, the Democrats and the Republicans are fighting. We do. We disagree on stuff. The House and Senate disagree on stuff. Urban and rural disagree on stuff. So those battles, those disagreements, those fights do happen. But the biggest fight is change. It's a whole lot easier to just keep the status quo going. So we don't necessarily want change. Because with these bills, right now, with most of the stuff, even if a lot of people disagree with the way things are going in the current status quo, if they vote on these bills, they are having to put their name on it and say that I think this needs to change. I think that we should not, that the businesses should not be able to force people to get a vaccine. Or I think that cities should not be able to require a mask mandate. Or I think, so they have to put their name on that by saying yes or no. If they don't have to vote on it, very few people will get mad at them. If they do have to vote on it, somebody's going to get mad at them because not everybody is going to agree on everything. So there are going to be people that are going to be upset. And so it's easier to just go, let's not change, let's not address that, let's not deal with that, let's just leave that alone. And hopefully, yes, people are upset right now, but if we don't do anything on it, maybe they'll be less upset, or in a short time period, they'll forget about it. So the biggest challenge is just let's not deal with that right now, because we don't want to upset anybody. Or the other thing is they'll say we don't want to do anything controversial. I'm considered very controversial because I do Second Amendment bills because I'm always taking on these battles that so few other people take on. But I agree. But, I saw somebody tweeted this out. They said the conservative mantra has kind of become that's not the hill to die on. But they've repeated that for 1,367 other hills that they've chosen not to die on, right? And so what I keep telling people is, yes, I'm taking on these battles, I'm fighting these battles. I've lost a lot of battles. I haven't been killed on any hills. I've lost some bills and some things, but if nobody gives voice to these concerns, if nobody fights these battles, we're just going to keep losing ground. And I mean, if you look at where our country is, I mean, not even 10 years ago, just 5 years ago, I mean, how much things have changed just because we haven't been vocal. Less than a year. Now with all this stuff, I mean, who would have thought that, at this time last year, that we would have to be having conversations about whether or not you can go to church in America, right? I mean, yeah. Or even like, I saw somebody else that said, which, the Supreme Court recently ruled and said that California cannot continue to prohibit churches from meeting as long as the churches meet at 25% capacity. Well, yay, that's great, but I saw somebody else that said, you couldn't think of anything more Republican or more conservative than fighting for 25% of your rights and calling it a day. Like, okay, we got 25% of our rights, but yes, we need a church at 25% capacity. Okay, so yeah, it's great. The Supreme Court made that decision, but if somebody, look at how long they had to fight that battle, and somebody had to file that lawsuit. And there's lawyers here in Oklahoma that have challenged some of these things and pushed back on it. And so, but it's easier to not do that. I mean, it's easier to not come out on a Thursday afternoon in the middle of a nice storm, right? It's easier to go along, get along, and not be considered controversial. So part of our problem in this country is that we've grown soft. I don't know if you've seen that analogy of hard times produce strong men produce good times produce weak men, and then the cycle starts again. Men and women, just in general. But that's where we're at. We've had years of plenty. We've been very blessed, and we've grown soft. We've grown even because of that. And it's happened throughout human history. So it's time that we need people standing up vocally, being strong, and saying, okay, I'm drawing the line here. I mean, I have a bill that would say that those under 18 cannot get gender reassignment surgery. You wouldn't think that you would have to have a bill to do that in America or in Oklahoma. But we've got to the point where it's become accepted, and I'm considered a monster by wanting to say, no, that child is a child and shouldn't be making these life-altering decisions because of what society has now deemed to be, you know, the norm or popular or acceptable or whatever you want to call it. Yes, those children are dealing with things and we need to address what they're dealing with, but that doesn't mean they need to have a life-altering surgery. But, you know, not filing that bill, yeah, I'm controversial, right? I mean, because it'd be a whole lot easier to say, hey, I don't want to get involved with that, you know? And so, that's why I enjoy coming out to these types of meetings. That's why I like meeting other people, because I started out on this. My first involvement in getting involved in government was 13 years ago, 14 years ago, in 2007. I moved back from the mission field. I was in Romania. I know we have some people from Romania here. And right around that time is when they started talking about the TARP bailout. I don't know if y'all remember that first big bailout with the banks, because the banks had made terrible financial decisions. And they said, okay, well, we're just going to print up $700 billion. It ended up being, I think, another 1.2 trillion or something. But we're just going to print up money out of thin air and bail out the banks. Well, I had lived over in Romania where they had massive inflation. Like, it destroyed people's retirement, it destroyed their savings. I lived through inflation. So that's what got me involved in government, because I've seen some of these things. I've seen propaganda. I've seen socialism. I've seen these things. That's why I got so involved. But most everybody else in America hasn't seen that. We have our amenities. We've done kind of soft. It isn't until we start feeling a little bit of pain that people are starting to get vocal. So I guess, I mean, I know I'm kind of rambling, you know, I'm just talking about kind of some of the issues, but the biggest problem is state capital is not wanting to change, not wanting to take on those battles, not wanting to take on those fights, not wanting people to get upset at you. It's not that I don't care about people's opinions or their emotions. They certainly have those opinions and their emotions, but I'm not going to elevate those above the Constitution or above other people's rights. I understand that some people will be upset and emotional and possibly fearful because I'm saying government should not force you to have to wear a mask or force a business to require masks. I'm not saying masks shouldn't be worn. People want to do it too, but I'm saying we should force it. There's going to be people that are upset at me. So it's not that I'm saying I don't care about their opinion, I don't value their opinion, but I'm not going to elevate their opinion above the rights of others. But that's just not the perspective.
Businesses, because small businesses have been hurt very badly, closed down. Well, now Biden has this reopening plan, and within there, he's got the startup money for businesses and the criteria for it. But also, they have a section in there called Safe Shoppers. And so, what that means is you accept that money, he's going to, this was their words, was mobilize over 100,000 people. Those people are selected from every community in the nation. And then you are evaluated if you're in compliance, and they're going to put signage in your school window to say that it's safe to shop. Yeah. And all of a sudden, I'm thinking of history, Nazi Germany. And so, my concern is, are the businesses desperate enough to take that money?
I think a lot of them are. For a lot of them, I don't know. I mean, people have to think about how they can take care of their families and stuff, right? And so that's the problem with a lot of this, is if we don't learn from history, we're going to repeat it. And that's not to equate everything to Nazi Germany.
Exactly, I'm sorry.
But no, but I mean, but this has happened. I mean, the the history of government is that government grows and liberty shrinks. And that's the history of throughout humanity of every government. And throughout history, if you look at every government, governments have done terrible things to even their own people. It's not like just to other people. I mean, it's happened throughout history. And I'm not just saying government is all inherently bad or inherently evil or whatever. I mean, humanity has a sin problem that needs to be addressed. That's the root of it. But government, because it is people in positions of power, they tend to abuse that power. That's just the reality of it. And so that's why we need to limit government and restrain it as much as we can and push back on it. And that's why the founding fathers created the Constitution to be limited government, to restrain it. We don't follow the Constitution anymore. The federal government doesn't. But that was the intent, was because they understood that. I forget which founding father it was, but one of the founding fathers said he studied history and war so that his sons could study math. So, so that they would have that peaceable environment. But again, let's say cycle, you create a good environment, and then that creates weak individuals, from it potentially. So, I mean, I think you're right. I think that there's always the possibility of how far is this going to go. I know that's kind of a slippery fallacy of how far could it possibly go. But I can give you example after example of things in state government that I warned about that years later came to fruition. But when I warned about it, they said, oh, well, that's not going to happen or that won't happen. And I mean, some of it is simple things. Like one time we had a bill that would require just a voluntary registration. Okay, well, it was voluntary until 2 years later when they made it mandatory. And that was my question. I said, this opens the door for it to become mandatory. And they said, well, no, it will never be mandatory. They said, never. 2 years later, it was. So I coined a phrase one time during the debate. I said, foresight quickly dismissed becomes hindsight easily ignored. So I'll say that again. Foresight quickly dismissed becomes hindsight easily ignored. You have the foresight to be saying, not just foresight, you're even looking back at history and you're saying, you're having the foresight to say, well, historically, this is what has happened. Well, what's going to happen is people will dismiss that and they'll say, well, maybe so, but probably not. That's just your foresight. Well, in 6 months or a year or however long, when that comes about, well, now if you bring it back up, they'll say, well, yeah, but hindsight is 2020. Well, it wasn't hindsight when you said it now, having the foresight to say it, but they'll quickly, they'll ignore it because they dismissed it previously.
But is there something to encourage businesses that are in this? Is there some alternatives so that they don't bring in the federal government?
I mean, if we, I don't know at the state level as far as financially, but if we pass a bill saying that all businesses are essential, and they can't be shut down, then that would make sure that they at least know going forward, they'll know that they'll be able to stay open and they won't have to shut down again arbitrarily if the federal government tells them that they have to. Because right now, yeah, I mean, there's a possibility that they might be forced to shut down. So people are probably thinking, well, maybe I need to take that money in case they shut it down. But, I don't know exactly what we do on the financial side from the state level, but if we just say our businesses are essential and we refuse to let them get shut down again, I think that would solve one of the big problems for these business owners. How we doing on time? We're at 4 o'clock. I don't mind staying a little bit longer, but if anybody needs to leave,
Would the attorney, back to her recent question there, that might spill over into the realm of legalities. So can the attorney general or can we as a state prohibit the discrimination of general funds coming to the businesses, whether or not they comply?
I don't know, again.
I mean, it's a legal issue.
Yeah, it depends on how the federal funds come and everything. Yeah, I'm not sure on that one exactly. Yeah. And I will say this, I mean, I know I'm doing a lot of the talking, but, like the North Dakota, South Dakota ideas. Great idea. I didn't come up with that. I come up with other great ideas, but I didn't come up with that one.
Yeah.
So if you all have ideas, if you all are experiencing something, if you see something, I'm always open to suggestions and stuff. I don't pretend to have all the answers. And even the answers I'm given, they're not mine. I try to base my stuff on Constitution and other things. So if anybody has suggestions on ways we can solve some of these problems, let me know.
The Dakota ideas weren't exactly new.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they go back to the Virginia and the Kentucky resolutions, which
Jefferson,
is 1789,
Mm-hmm.
88. So.
Yes, ma'am.
It's something that is not controversial. It's about Oklahoma has a high number of drug addicts and high mortality from overdose. And it was a program initiated by the Trump administration to treat that. And that program allowed doctors to prescribe morphine derivatives besides naloxone to treat the patients with
The addiction.
yeah.
Get them off of it.
And now the Biden executive orders terminated the program. And I think the problem was that Trump allowed all the doctors to prescribe the morphine derivative, any doctor, and now they have to undergo like 8 hours of training, special training, just to prescribe something they know very well. And usually the people in the rural areas do not have access to such doctors. So I think this can be easily fixed by allowing all the doctors to prescribe, as it used to be before during Trump administration.
I'll have to look into that. I mean, I think that would be something that we can do. Like I told him, it's past bill filing deadline, but there is a way that if there's an existing bill out there, we can look and see if we can put language in to correct that. I know we had a bill just the other day dealing some with like drug courts and some of that type of stuff, trying to help with some of those things. I don't know if that would fit. But that's one bill that I know we just dealt with that might fit in that. So that's something that we can look into. You saw anybody online?
Yeah, there's a few, but nobody's got any questions.
No questions from online? Okay. Well, I'll stick around and talk if anybody wants to talk and everything. I do want to get on the road at some point in time. So we're getting back to Broken Arrow before any bad weather hits. Again, I'll just reiterate, please contact the other senators. Be polite when you do though, but ask them where they stand on this and why. Especially the Senate is the first focus because we got to get the bills to the Senate to get them over to the House. So contact the committee chairs. That's the first priority. Contact the committee members on those committees. That's the second priority. Get your senators, and your representative. While you're doing that, but be reaching out to them and see where they stand on this. If they'd like to, if they'll put their voice behind these as well, and hopefully get this across the finish line.
What's the best way to contact them? Is there a certain email, phone?
So if you go on the website, it does list their phone, their email. If you have an iPhone or an Android or whatever, there is an app. I'll actually pull this up, and it's produced by the electric co-ops. If you go to the state capitol, they always do a printout of all the senators and House members, their picture, their name, what committees they serve on. But there's an app. It's called Oklahoma's 58th Legislative Guide. And if you search that, you might have to search OAEC, the Oklahoma Electric Co-ops. But if you search that, it's really great. You can click on it, and it has the directory. It has statewide, so that's governor, all that type of stuff, Senate, House. And so you can go on Senate, and you can go by leadership, by members, or by committees. So if you go to the committee, and top one is agriculture, it lists the chairman, the vice chairman, all the committee members. And then if you click on their information, it has what counties they cover. It has their phone number, their email address, and the name of their executive assistant. On the Senate side, we each have an executive assistant that runs our office at the Capitol. So you can call and say, "Hey, Lindsay, I'm so-and-so calling." And then it lists all the committees that they serve on. So it's a really good app, really easy to be able to contact people. It's done by the OAEC, the Oklahoma Electric Co-ops, but it's just called Oklahoma's 58th Legislature. We're in the 58th Legislature right now. So if you search for that, it's on both, the Apple Store and Google Play. That's a great way to be able to just contact them. I will say emails, it's easy to hit the delete button. Handwritten letters and notes, yes, you can just throw it in the trash can, but that's harder to do. Phone calls, doing the same thing. It's easy to hit the delete button. So I encourage people to use all means possible, like call if you can, send an email if you can, contact them through their social media, send them a private message or whatever if they're on any social media. Use all those means possible. But the one thing that I will say, most of the legislature doesn't give a whole lot of consideration to is when we get form letters, where we get 100 of the same thing that says, "Hello, my name is so and so," and I think that and it's exact same paragraph from every single person. We know that you're just typing your name in a website or something, and it's auto-generating that and sending us the same thing. And so we don't know if that's a bot. We don't know if they're a constituent. We don't know if that is a thing. So if you personalize it, that does stand out more if you take the time to do that. And if you are a constituent, make sure to mention, "Hey, I'm a voter in your district." Again, it doesn't really work if you say I'm a voter in your district, and if you don't do this, I'm voting you out next election cycle. Right? Okay. Especially, I'm sorry, but I love to tease the people that are always saying that they're going to vote me out next election. I'm term limited, so they can't. So when they say that, it just shows how ill-informed they are. So like when and yes, I understand you have a vote, I get that. But when you're trying to threaten that, when it's not even a real threat, so yeah, you can say that you're a constituent, but just try to be polite when you're communicating with them, especially the assistants. They get a lot of junk that they have to deal with. They're not even the one that gets to vote or anything. All right, any last question?
Oh, is that
What
got
I
a
was
camera?
gonna ask you.
I was afraid he was gonna get knocked off.
That's your last.
Okay, so you asked about term limits. Term limits, there's pros and cons to both of them.
No, but I mean, where do you?
Oh, where am I
what-
currently?
Yeah.
So I just got reelected back in November, so I have 4 years left. So I'm in my
Oh,
final.
good. Well, we'll keep you busy.
But I will say term limits, there's good and bad to it. Like,
Oh, yeah.
we lost Senator Sykes.
Yeah.
His replacement is a nice guy, and pretty solid on all these things. I'm not saying anything about him, but Senator Sykes was phenomenal. If I could have him up there, we get a bunch of people there. We'd be well.
The big downside, besides we lose some good people, but we lose some bad ones too. But the big downside, in my humble opinion, is unless we term limit the managerial bureaucrats,
Yeah,
we've just
yeah,
turned over the
administrators.
continuity of our government to unelected officials.
And that is what happens with a lot of
That
it.
happens
And it
every
empowers
time.
the lobbyists too.
You try to get rid of some of the state departments in their heads and see.
Yes, sir. Well, again, thank you all for having me come out and everything.
Yeah,
Thanks for coming.
If anybody wants that, if you like my contact information, I left some out in my car. I shouldn't have put that in my mouth. I think I have in my car. I'll go grab them. I have little prayer magnets that you just stick on your fridge. It says you'll commit to pray 1 day a week. You pick the day. So I would appreciate your prayers, but stick it on your fridge. Hopefully you go to the fridge at least once a week. But then I'll serve as a reminder. Just pray for me. Pray for your mayor. Pray for your state rep. Pray for the president. No matter who the president is, say your prayer. Yes, you can change your prayers depending on who it is. So please keep that in mind. But I'll go grab some of those. I think I have a couple pocket constitutions too. If anybody wants any of those, so I'll go grab those real quick and I'll come right back. But thank you guys for having me.
Thank
Any
you.
other-
Thank you, Deborah.
I do have a quick announcement for you. Robert Armstrong, which is the other candidate for mayor here in Duncan, had an emergency, had to leave, and he had requested and is reserving a similar town hall conversation for next Wednesday at 2:30. So that'll be out on the Facebook page and published out there, but it'll be his event. He'll be coordinating it, but he is requesting the same opportunity to have a conversation. So if you really want to get involved in the mayor's candidate race here in Duncan, he'll be here to answer any questions like that at 2:30 next Wednesday. On behalf of Birdie and Coffee, my wife Lindsay and I, as the owners, we really appreciate you all being here. To keep in mind, I mean, we may or may not agree with all these things, but we are very open to hosting any conversation, pro or against, on any political event here in our community. So we'd invite you all to continue this conversation with any representative or any government official. We'd host and be kind and welcoming to everyone. So we'd love to have you all here to continue to do this. And we are humbled and honored that on behalf of the senator and the rest of the community that you all choose to be here to do this with us. So y'all have a blessed day, and the senator's back to answer any questions, and y'all have a great day. Okay?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Shane. Thanks for providing the place
Absolutely, absolutely.
and the technology.
It works.
It works great.
I think it works.